When we think of ghost stories, we often imagine a single central haunting, a specific house or a specific spirit that follows a family through a series of terrifying encounters. But W. Bob Holland's collection, 25 Ghost Stories, works a little differently. It isn't a single long narrative, but rather a series of snapshots. Some are brief, others are more fleshed out, but they all share a common, unsettling feeling. It is the sense that the world we see around us, the streets we walk, the rooms we sit in, the people we interact with, is actually quite fragile. It's as if reality is just a thin, decorative curtain, and if you pull at the thread in the wrong place, the whole thing might simply vanish, leaving nothing but a cold, empty void behind. To understand how Holland approaches this, it helps to look at his most substantial narrative, which sets the tone for the entire collection. It begins with a man named Professor Benjamin Davenport. Davenport is a man of considerable charisma and an even more considerable reputation, but it is a dark one. He is a medium operating out of a New York hotel, a man who makes a living by convincing the grieving that their loved ones are just a few inches away, separated from them only by the veil of death. But Davenport isn't actually talking to the dead. He is a master of deception, using muslin, wigs, and clever vocal mimicry to orchestrate elaborate spiritualist frauds. He isn't alone in his work. He has an assistant named Ida Southshot. Ida is a tragic figure, an emaciated woman who seems to be physically wasting away. It isn't just the long hours or the physical strain of the performances that are taking their toll, it is the weight of the lies. She is consumed by guilt, and she begins to fear that their deceptions are not just social lies, but moral ones that might invite divine retribution. She begs Davenport to stop, to walk away from the charade before the darkness they've created catches up to them. Davenport, however, is a man driven by a desperate need to maintain his status and perhaps to bury his own past. There are whispers that his first wife, Arabella, didn't die of natural causes, but was the victim of his temper and his abuse. In a calculated attempt to rehabilitate his image and silence the rumors, Davenport plans a high-stakes séance. He wants to conjure Arabella's spirit to prove to his skeptics that she is at peace, that she is happy in the afterlife. He wants to use the supernatural to prove that he is a man of God rather than a man of crime. The tension in the hotel room is thick during the final confrontation between Davenport and Ida. There is a violent argument, a heavy sound of something hitting the floor, and a sense that the atmosphere in the room has become toxic. When the séance finally begins, Davenport is a success in the technical sense. He performs feats of levitation and telekinesis that leave the 40 guests in attendance breathless. For a moment, it seems as though the fraud is working perfectly, but the performance takes a terrifying turn. The spirit of Arabella materializes, but she is not the peaceful, ethereal being Davenport promised. Instead, she appears as a wounded, suffering apparition. In front of the horrified crowd, she directly accuses Davenport of her murder. The illusion of the medium's control shatters completely. In the chaos and the sheer terror of the moment, Ida Southshot's heart simply gives out. She dies right there, a victim of the very atmosphere of deception she had tried so hard to escape. The story doesn't end with a ghostly disappearance, but with a very human, very grim reality. Davenport is arrested and charged with his wife's murder. A fraud didn't bring him closer to the truth. It stripped away his protection and left him exposed to the law. This theme of deception being met by a much more terrifying truth is a thread that runs through much of Holland's work. We see it again in The Phantom Woman, which shifts the focus away from the stage and into the quiet, observational life of a solicitor named Gilbert Dent. Dent is a man of habit and observation, and he becomes obsessed with a mysterious woman he sees every evening through a window. He watches her from a distance, a silent admirer of a life he can only see through glass. His infatuation, however, turns into a profound, bone-chilling horror. One evening, he looks through that window and sees her again, but she is no longer the graceful figure of his imagination. She is dead, her body contorted in a way that suggests a violent or sudden end. It is a moment of pure, visceral shock. But the horror doesn't end with the sight of the corpse. When Dent returns to the scene with a policeman, intent on reporting the gruesome discovery, he finds that the room is entirely empty. The woman, the body, the very evidence of death has vanished. The house remains vacant and silent for years, a hollow shell that offers no explanation for what Dent saw. The impossibility of the disappearance leaves him haunted, not by a ghost, but by the fact that the physical world failed to behave according to the rules he has lived his entire life by. This idea of the vanishing is perhaps the most unsettling element of Holland's writing. It isn't just that ghosts appear, it's that entire realities can simply blink out of existence. We see a different version of this in the final segment, which moves away from the gothic and the psychological into something almost surreal. The scene is a high-stakes bicycle race. The atmosphere is electric, filled with the energy of competition and the roar of a crowd. The two main competitors are Riley and Harry. As the race reaches its peak, Harry attempts a desperate and lethal act of sabotage. He rides his horse directly into Riley's path, attempting to run him off the road and ensure his own victory through violence. It is a moment of intense, human aggression. Riley, however, manages to navigate the danger. He stays on his bike, he maintains his course, and he crosses the finish line as the winner. But the victory is met with an impossible, crushing silence. The cheering crowds, the military presence that had lined the route, the very life of the event, it all vanishes instantly. Riley finds himself in a landscape that is suddenly, inexplicably deserted. The only evidence that anything of importance had just happened is a pile of broken glass found in a nearby farmhouse where Riley had been held earlier. It's a jarring, nonsensical piece of evidence for a scene that should have been filled with thousands of people. The sudden transition from the peak of human excitement to a total empty void is more unsettling than a traditional ghost story could ever be. When we step back and look at these stories together, a pattern emerges. Holland seems less interested in the mechanics of how a ghost is made and more interested in what happens when the human world is punctured. There is a recurring tension between deception and truth. In the story of Davenport, the man uses physical props to fake a spiritual truth, only to find that a real, much more judgmental truth has been waiting in the wings to strike him down. The lies he told to maintain his status only served to hide the crimes that the supernatural world was waiting to expose. This leads us to the idea of the thin veil. In many of these tales, the boundary between what is real and what is spectral is incredibly fragile. It isn't a solid wall, it's a curtain that can be torn. When Dent sees the vanishing woman, or when Riley finds himself in a deserted landscape after a massive race, the implication is that our reality is not as stable as we think. We move through our lives assuming that if we see a person, they are there, and if a crowd is cheering, they will continue to cheer. But Holland suggests that these things are merely layers of experience that can be stripped away in an instant, leaving us standing in a vacuum. There is also a strong sense of retribution and guilt. The characters who face the most terrifying supernatural elements are often those who have committed some form of moral transgression. Davenport's abuse of his wife and Harry's attempt at lethal sabotage are both acts of human malice that trigger responses that defy logic. The universe in these stories doesn't just react with justice, it reacts with an absurdity that is far more frightening than a simple courtroom trial. The punishment doesn't just fit the crime, it breaks the logic of the world itself. Ultimately, the most recurring motif in the collection is the void. It is that sudden, heavy silence that follows a moment of intense human connection or conflict. Whether it is the death of Ida Southshot, the empty room after the Phantom Woman's death, or the deserted landscape after the bicycle race, there is a sense of profound isolation. The characters are left alone in a world that has suddenly become much larger and much emptier than they ever realized. It is a strange way to look at the supernatural. Usually, ghosts are seen as something that enters our world, something that breaks in from the outside to haunt us. But in Holland's stories, it feels more like the ghosts are what remains when the illusion of our world is stripped away. The ghost isn't the intruder. The ghost is the emptiness that was always there, waiting just behind the curtain of our daily lives. It suggests a world that is not just haunted, but one that is fundamentally unreliable. A place where the only thing we can be certain of is the silence that follows when the lights go out.